The Eyes of the Killer Robot by John Bellairs, Chapter 4. The rest of August passed and Labor Day arrived. The professor had a big cookout in his backyard to mark the holiday, and 2 days later Johnny went back to school. Soon he was all wrapped up in important matters like the square of the hypotenuse and the fourth principal part of the Latin verb pello. The blue Ford and the ghostly midnight visitor faded into the back of Johnny's mind, and his life began to glide along on a fairly even keel. But sometimes, when he was alone in the front hallway of the professor's house, he would take the sword out of the umbrella rack and draw the thin tarnished blade. Then he would mutter, "On guard," or "Have at thee, recreant," and pretend that he was the Count of Monte Cristo or D'Artagnan, and lunge and thrust at imaginary enemies. With a sigh, he would put the sword cane back and wonder for the 500th time if he would ever know why the ghost had given him this sword. Or had the sword been meant for Fergie or the professor? The whole business was so crazy, so nonsensical. Why come back from the dead to give a gift if nobody knew what the gift was for? As the days of September passed, these questions faded further and further into the back of Johnny's mind, and he began to think that the answers really didn't matter much at all. One day, late in September, Johnny and Fergie were walking home from school together. They were gossiping about their teachers and crabbing about their homework assignments the way kids often do. As they turned onto Fillmore Street, where Johnny lived, they noticed that about half the leaves were off the trees, and in the air hung the smell of burning leaves. But there was another smell, too. Johnny's nostrils twitched as he sniffed the odd aroma and tried to figure out what it was. "That's a funny smell," he said as he glanced around curiously. Suddenly, Fergie lifted his head and pointed. "Look! That's what it is!" A short way down the street stood the professor's gray stucco house. The professor stood in the driveway, burning notebooks and papers. A heap of them was smoldering near his feet and sending up clouds of thick, whitish smoke. The professor reached into the cardboard box he was holding and pinched another fistful of white and blue sheets into the flames. As they drew closer, the boys could see that the expression on the professor's face was unbelievably crabby. They wondered what had come over him. An odd thought flashed into Johnny's mind. He had often heard the professor say that he would rather burn his students' papers than read them. Maybe at last he had given in to an overwhelming urge, or perhaps his mind had cracked under the strain of too much teaching. Either way, it didn't look good. With Fergie leading the way, the two boys crossed the street and headed for the gray stucco house. When the professor saw them, he turned and glowered. "Well," he said fiercely through clenched teeth. "Hi, Prof," said Fergie, waving cheerfully. He paused and glanced at the box that the professor held in his arms. Then he coughed and forced himself to smile. What you doing, huh?" The professor grimaced and shook a bunch of papers in Fergie's face. "What does it look like I'm doing? I'm cleaning out the back room of my study. Something that has needed doing for ages, and if you must know, I'm doing this so I won't do something more unpleasant, like throw rocks through my neighbor's windows. The fact is, you see, I've gotten some bad news." Johnny's hand flew to his mouth. "Oh no, what?" The professor put the box down on the ground, reached into his hip pocket and pulled out a folded piece of letter paper. "Here," he said, handing the paper to Johnny. "You can read the rotten news for yourself." With a puzzled expression on his face, Johnny unfolded the note. At the top was an official-looking letterhead that said MT Oil Co., San Antonio, Texas. Beneath this was a brief note. To all stockholders, MT Oil Company regrets that it will be unable to pay any dividends on its stocks until further notice. Sincerely, T. Branwell Briggs, Chairman of the Board. Johnny gave the professor a puzzled look. "In case you're wondering," growled the professor as he threw more papers into the fire, "that little message means we are failing. We are about to go bankrupt. And $10,000 of my money is going to go bye-bye along with the MT Oil Company." Johnny was alarmed. "Is that all the money you had saved up, Professor?" The professor smiled sourly. "No," he snapped, "but it's a fairly large chunk of it. Up until just recently, I had all my savings in nice safe securities and bonds. But then I had lunch with this lawyer I know, and he told me that MT Oil was going to make a major oil strike in the near future, and that I could really clean up if I invested in their stock. Normally, I don't play the stock market. But, well, I had this crazy idea. I would make a big wad and then give some to your grandparents so they wouldn't be so poor. Great plan, wasn't it?" Johnny was shocked and his eyes filled with tears. It was true that his grandma and grandpa didn't have much money, but his dad would have helped them out if they had gotten into any real financial trouble. He wished that he had told the professor this, then maybe he wouldn't have. "Don't worry, Prof," said Fergie cheerfully. "They'll probably come up with a gusher, and then you'll really be in the chips." "Fat chance," muttered the professor. Suddenly the professor remembered something. He dug his watch out of his pocket and squinted at it. "However," he said, grinning, "things are not all that bad. In 2 minutes, I have an ooey-gooey chocolate cake coming out of the oven, and I'm going to cover it with great globs of my buttery dark mocha frosting. And if you two are very good, you can help me eat some of it, okay?" A few minutes later, Fergie and Johnny were sitting at the round oak table in the professor's kitchen. Their mouths were smeared with frosting, and they were attacking huge pieces of cake with their forks. The professor was over by the sink, pouring iced tea into 3 tall glasses filled with ice cubes. On the drain board near the glasses was a folded newspaper, and every now and then the professor would peer owlishly at it. Suddenly he let out a loud exclamation. "Good grief," he said in an annoyed voice. "The paper says that Cliff Bullard of the Yankees is going to be at the athletic field in Dustin Heights on October 15th. Remember the 10,000 smackaroos he's offering to any local boy who can strike him out? Oh boy, wouldn't I just love to see some big strong kid collect that loot and make Bullard look like the idiot that he is. I tell you, I would drive miles to see." The professor's voice trailed off, and he smiled strangely. A weird and wonderful idea had come floating into his head. Humming quietly, he put the 3 iced tea glasses on a tray and carried them over to the table. Then he sat down and cut himself a big piece of cake. Johnny and Fergie watched him like hawks. They knew that something was up. "Okay, Prof, what's on your mind?" asked Fergie. "Whenever you get some hotshot idea, you start acting strange, so come on, tell us." The professor paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked at the 2 boys uncertainly, as if he really wasn't sure what he wanted to say. "I know you 2 will razz me and tell me this is a totally batty idea," he began. "But I was wondering if I could humiliate Cliff Bullard and get back the 10,000 smackers I lost in the stock market at the same time." Johnny stared. "How the heck could you do that, Professor?" The professor smiled mysteriously. He ate a bite of cake and chewed it slowly. "Easy," he said at last. "All we have to do is find Everestus Sloane's robot." Johnny's mouth dropped open, and so did Fergie's. The professor had caught them completely off guard. There was an awkward silence. The professor gobbled some more cake and wiped his mouth with his napkin. "You boys don't think I've flipped my lid, do you?" he snapped. "Well, I'm as sane as anyone in this room, and I think that the robot still exists. It's probably rusting to pieces in some barn up in New Hampshire, but I'll bet it could be put back together. We could fix the motor and have something that could zip baseballs in at 110 miles an hour. Bullard would screw himself into the ground trying to hit those pitches." Johnny glanced uncomfortably at Fergie. He was really worried about the professor. In the past, the old man had come up with some wild notions, but they had always seemed to make some sort of sense. However, this idea made no sense at all. The professor suddenly leaped up and began pacing back and forth. "I know what we were going to ask," he said. "How are we going to win the contest with a robot? Only human beings are allowed to compete in the contest. You were wondering about that, weren't you?" "I was, kinda," muttered Johnny. The professor stopped, spun around, and pointed his finger at the boys. "Well, forget about your worries," he said loudly. "I think I have it figured out. The robot really was the one that struck out Clutch Clem back in the old days. I don't know how Sloane made people think the robot was a living, breathing human being, but I'll bet it had something to do with the new source of energy that Sloane discovered." And Johnny was getting more and more bewildered. "Energy source? Professor, you never said anything about that before." The professor blinked. "Didn't I? I must have left that part out when I told the story. You see, when Sloane rolled his robot out and demonstrated it to the baseball players, no one could figure out how it worked. There wasn't any steam or exhaust smoke pouring out of it, so everyone figured there had to be one of those electric motors inside it. But when Sloane let them see the inside of the robot, the players only saw gears and machinery, no motor. In those days, an electric motor would have been big and heavy, and it would have hooked up to big heavy batteries or a generator. But there wasn't any such thing in the robot. Well, something ran the blasted thing. I can't figure out what the energy source was, but it allowed Sloane to create an illusion when he brought the robot back later. I don't know how he made people think the robot was a man. I don't know how he made the bland thing run. That's what fascinates me. The answer may be hidden away somewhere, gathering dust in a storeroom or an old shed. Doesn't that rouse your spirit of adventure? Fergie looked skeptical. Look, Prof, he said slowly. If this Sloane character really did discover a new source of energy, wouldn't he have sold it to the government for $1 million? The professor shook his head. No, a sane person would have done that. But Everest Sloane was crazy. And he was very, very secretive. He probably decided that nobody deserved to know about his wonderful secret. Of course, it's possible that he smashed the robot and burned all his plans. But it is also possible that he didn't. Do you know where the robot could be, Professor? Asked Johnny timidly. The professor bit his lip and looked uncertain. It could be up in Sloane's old house in New Hampshire, a little bitty burg called Stark Corners. I'm planning to drive up this weekend. You two are welcome to come along, but by golly, if I have to, I'll go alone. Well, what do you yardbirds say? Fergie and Johnny looked at each other. They both thought that this stuff about robots and secret energy sources was loony, but they didn't have anything wonderful planned for the weekend, and they both enjoyed going on car trips with the professor, and the idea appealed to their love of adventure. Even if they only found an old rusting heap of metal that had once been a robot, they would be doing something interesting. After a long pause, Fergie spoke up. Prof? Yes, Byron, what is it? Well, we want to have a conference. Johnny and me, that is, the professor smirked. A high-level conference. Gracious me, I ought to feel honored to have it held under my roof. Certainly, by all means, go right ahead. The two boys got up and went out to the dining room. They closed the heavy oak door and talked in low tones for about 5 minutes, and then came back. Fergie plunked himself down in a chair, folded his arms, and looked at the professor. Okay, Prof, he said crisply. Here's what we decided. We'd like to go along with you, but if we don't find anything right away, we want to have some fun. You know what I mean? The professor smiled sourly. Gentlemen, he said, I have no desire to spend the entire weekend prying up floorboards in old barns in New Hampshire. You have my solemn promise. If we don't find anything by Saturday night, we will give up. And then we'll have all day Sunday to cruise around the White Mountains and look at the pretty leaves. But before we go, I'd like to say one thing. I'm not promising you a wonderful adventure. We might end up being bored out of our ever-loving minds. On the other hand, you never can tell. We might uncover some wonderful mystery that has been hidden from the world for a long time. And that is the end of chapter 4.